I know we depend on it now.
Right, we depend on it, right? And
No way.
you know, it's a tremendous blessing, and it's also a tremendous blessing to have you here today.
Thank you, my brother. Thank you.
No,
Thank
no,
you.
really, thank you.
Very
So we
grateful to
are,
you.
no, well, I'm very grateful to you, and we are indeed live. So just to introduce our really wonderful guests today, it's we have Professor Cláudio Carvalhaes with us. Professor Carvalhaes is Associate Professor of Worship at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Professor Carvalhaes is an earth thinker, a theologian, a liturgist, and artist, and a native of Brazil. He completed his Ph.D. in liturgy and theology at Union Theological Seminary in 2007. He earned his first Master of Philosophy degree in theology, philosophy, and history at the Methodist University of Sao Paulo in 1997, and a Master of Divinity degree from the Independent Presbyterian Theological Seminary in 1992. Since 2016, Professor Carvalhaes joined Union Theological Seminary as the Associate Professor of Worship, previously having taught at McCormick Theological Seminary, Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, and Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. Professor Carvalhaes is also an ordained pastor within the Presbyterian Church in the U.S.A. And by way of, you know, something of a personal touch, I'm very genuinely grateful to Professor Carvalhaes. During my brief stint at Union Theological, as it so happens, this was totally unintentional.
Wasn't it? When I saw it, I loved it. I thought you had put it because of our conversation.
Well, as it's so I have like I pride myself in not having too many clothes, and they're usually like black t-shirts, and they just kind of, I just go through the cycle, whichever one it happens to be. It happens to be the case that today's
perfect. I love that. A Union shirt. I have one. If I knew, I would have had the same one.
Well, you're representing in other ways, but you know, I was at Union Theological Seminary doing a Master's in Divinity, which I didn't finish. I'm one semester shy of completing that, but Professor Carvalhaes, I was very moved by his and continue to be moved by his presence. A deeply genuine. This is not like, you know, this is genuine.
Thank you, my brother. Thank you
from the heart. That Professor Carvalhaes is a deeply compassionate, deeply humane, and caring professor, and academic, and teacher, theologian, and pastor, which is very rare today. I mean, as someone who's, you know, spent enough time you know, in the past, as one could say, I still am in some ways involved sort of in other ways with, you know, the academy, but the academy is all too often full of big egos. And, you know, Professor Carvalhaes genuinely is not egotistical, is a very humble, compassionate, loving human being, which is such a breath of fresh air, genuinely. And we're here today, amongst other things, to talk about a little bit Professor Carvalhaes' wonderful new work, which is entitled Ritual at World's End, the subtitle being Essays on Eco-Liturgical Liberation Theology, which, I mean, I'd love for Professor Carvalhaes to unpack the title a little bit, but before we do that, I was hoping that you'd kindly speak a little bit to this phrase that you use from Gramsci in your work, it turns out, which is the idea of the organic intellectual. And you strike me very much as someone who is very much involved in a type of organic work, which is not just speaking to the small, you know, 10, 15, 20, if we're lucky, a few hundred, if we're really lucky, maybe a few, like you're very genuinely interested in speaking to the people, through the people, by the people, as it were. If you could speak.
That's right. Thank you. Oh, so let me just say how grateful I am to you. And since you left Union, that's our first time actually seeing each other. And I'm so grateful. And your story is so powerful. And the ability that you have to move within structures and places and thinking and believing, and it is so powerful. And I love your story. I have written about your story, and I am in awe with the ways in which you have this expansive mind and heart in ways that serves as a way to think with you and to feel with you. And so I'm very, very grateful, and very grateful to our time together at Union, and how brilliant you always been, and learning with you. And so to be together here, it's such a joy. Thank you. I feel honored.
I usually kind of exit after my initial introduction, and so you saw me, excuse me, fiddling around. I just wanted to say, I'm deeply humbled by your very kind comments, and really, I mean, it means a lot, not least coming from you.
Thank you.
Sometimes, hopefully one doesn't do this work just for the sake of appreciation, but sometimes it's nice to hear some words of encouragement.
Absolutely, we all need that.
And it's a complicated. I mean, I sort of am very complex, and I think very often people don't know where to place me. I myself don't know where to place myself, but in any case,
that's the fantastic thing about you.
Yeah.
You are in always this liminal place. It's like you remember me of Gloria Anzaldúa, this Mexican U.S. thinker that talks about life at the borders, and the borders she calls is always an open wound, and so you live in many borders, and that is the fascinating thing about you. So.
I mean, again, so thank you so much, and I think one of, not to kind of go on and on here, but because really and the task today is to allow you to speak, but I think it's one of the almost sort of fundamental human needs is to be seen, as it were, and to be, when people can see you, as it were, it's the line from the Avatar movie, which which is I think a very interesting movie, but when one of the sort of two main characters, what they say to each other, I see you. So I mean, this is a deep human need, which ultimately can truly only be fulfilled by God. But as human beings living in society, living in communication and exchange with one another, we hope to be seen by one another to the best of our abilities. But again, I'm not going to hog the light. No, please speak.
But this is wonderful that you're saying, because that's the organic thing. It's what comes out, and we haven't prepared this, and this is what comes out. And this for me, it is at the heart of the book, which is to pay attention. So
please show us the cover. It's such a beautiful cover.
I'll show you because there's a meaning to it too.
Yes.
But I'll come back to it, because that's at the heart of what I'm doing here, is to pay attention. So that's why what you're saying here, Hassan, without even knowing the depth of it, but is at the heart of this, to pay attention. So I'm going to get back to it. But to say about the book, this is a huge book. So if you got like a different book, look at the difference. It's very different. It's very different, a big book. So there's this other book here that just got that I need to read, as you know, the 1619. So it's kind of the same size of it, but
it's 432 pages. Is that right?
Yes, and the joy of doing this is that I was able to do it with a local publisher here, who's a local pastor who does a fantastic work. And so we did it together. We sat down and we said, so here's the concept, what I want to do. And he was so open. And so it's the hands of my mother, who's 90 years old. And she worked in the fields growing up. And so the sense that, and then here and on the back, it is my hands in the kind of the Gwyneth River, which is a stream here, beautiful, fantastic very alive and filled with power, because it zigzags, and indigenous people say when a river zigzags because there's some potency, some sacredness there. And so this is the river. So the idea of the hands of my mother to mine is what I learned from indigenous people, that when what we live, we have to care for 7 generations at least. Some say 8 generations, but 7 generations. So 3 before us, ours, and 3 after us.
I remember, so I wanted to actually, very sorry to interrupt, but that reminded me of when I read that, when I came across the mentioning of the 7 generations, how I remember reading here about many years ago, I think Howard Zinn talks about this in The People's History of the United States, that the Iroquois, they tribe, Native American tribe, they refused to make a decision that would, without any major decision, without considering how it would affect subsequent 7 generations.
Precisely. Right? So this concept that you're just saying, Hassan, should be the ethical stand for any use of, for instance, i.e. for computers, for what are we going to use and what will that do, or atomic issues of energy. What's going to do for the next generations? Like in 100 years, what we do now, that gosh, I'm forgetting the name of this kind of energy that is that you have to put in containers in cement, but those cements are going to Japan is dealing with it now, and what's going to do to the
something to do with nuclear waste, or
nuclear waste. That's what I was looking for. Thank you. And we are using now, and what's going to happen for the next generation. So that what you're saying should be like a stand. So if we do not know what's going to do for the next generation, we cannot. So that's precisely it. So what I receive has to be concerned with what I do and what I gave to my kids and the future generation. So you are at the heart of it. That's precisely it. And I think that's what we need to do to shift and change the ways we think our world and the earth now, if we are to have any future for the coming generations. So this whole sense of the organic intellectual that you talk about is, for me, it is unfolding in ways that I even mentioned much here in the book. But this was always with me, coming from Latin America, the fact of being from liberation theology, and it's always like the organic intellectual is the intellectual that is with the people, that it is organized with that, what is organic, what is moving, coming, sprouting forth, and happening at the ground with the people, what people are doing and living in. And so you go there and you see how they live, and from that form of living, you actually start to think with and from. And so you organize this different kinds of knowledges, the oral knowledge, the lived form of knowledge, with the traditions and the forms of the books of the intellectuals and other people. So you combine this knowledge and put them together, one wrestling with the other, changing, transforming the other. But what is coming to me now, it is that the organic, it is not only organic in the sense of the organization of the people, but organic in terms of the organicity of the earth, of the life of the earth. It's like the organic is literally to think with the land, with the soil, with the rivers, with the oceans, with the forests, with the animals. And so the organic has to do with a different form of life. So for me, like today, to do theology, we have to do biology, because it is to understand what life is all about. And theology only talks about the humans most of the time, or almost all the time. But but we need to think how to think life in a much more broader way. If you're talking about God, what God has to do with the worms right here next to me? What is it that in my faith I believe that has to do with the birds that are singing?
You have a wonderful turn of phrase. Sorry to interrupt again, but on this point at page 12, you say God lives within the universe. By the way, I just wanted to say, forgive me, I mentioned before we went live, I wasn't able to read from cover to cover, but you have as I've known from your other writings, you have a beautiful way of writing, very poetic, very engaging. And if I may read a tiny bit,
I love that.
Oh, please, because so that people can have a sense of your style. But
absolutely,
as I just realized I need to go backtrack to page 12. If you could say a little bit about the notion of God living within the universe, because all too often in theology, whether it's Christian, whether it's Islamic, just to stay with those two for now, those two that I'm more comfortable with. But there's this sense, you said theology all too often is anthropocentric, right? And what you're doing, what you're really reminding us of, is the fundamental purpose of theology, which is to point to the very experiential reality of God in and amongst all of creation. So I found it. Okay, as I was kind of
beautiful. They were saying, oh,
well, so you mentioned that on page this is on page 12. I am learning that God lives in the little chipmunk under my house, and I honor him as my neighbor. God lives within the universe, between gravity and dark matter, working with and against each other. God produces and sustains and is produced and sustained by the multiverses. God is everywhere in life, growing with cells and bacteria, seedlings, caterpillars, ants, dolphins, wolves, jaguars, the trees and rivers near my house, the clouds, my dog, Amora, my spouse, and our kids. The God of the natural world is my natural theology. No more is my God made of a singular male, anthropomorphic, one disembodied humanoid. Now I love a God of new myths and stories, making and shaping the universe in endless new divinities. God is among the poor, as the poor, resisting and re-existing every day. God is a collective desire to see all we used to call sacred and has always been in the natural world. No more a God as an idea of divinity, as a human comfort and as a control above everything else. No more control. Instead, the agency of God is in the plurality of the agencies of the universes, and each animal, each vegetable, each mineral, each cell, and each process of symbiosis. A God of endless relationalities, a God of reciprocity and mutuality, a God of 1,000 forms of liberation. Just to read that paragraph, I got chills reading that originally and rereading it now for our audience. God bless you. Really, it's so much to unpack there. But I'd love for you to unpack this further. This notion of God, your very sort of language. God lives within the universe, but also you say, you point very importantly to the central role played by the poor within this wider theological narrative, how all too often the poor have been marginalized in these narratives. And if you'll forgive me, if you could also speak, you have a very unusual background, unusual insofar as where you'll function today as a professor at a renowned theological institution. You come from a background, if you could say a little bit, so you're speaking to the needs of the poor. It's not just some kind of romanticized or want to look good, or it's something that's deeply personal for you, if I may put it like that.
Yeah, that's right. It is. I grew up in Sao Paulo, and in a poor neighborhood too. And so I think there was in me always the sense of seeing things that I could not get, and that made me pay attention to people who could have even less than me. And I was a shoe shining boy from 8 to 12, and so listen to stories of people and paying attention to shoes and barefoot kids. And so for me, always this is what is always in the back of my mind in everything that I do. So when I realized that the earth was part of this poor, in the sense of not being paid attention, not being seen. And then so how do I wrestle with that sense of paying attention to what I have never paid attention to, or how does that notion of the earth is still deeply connected with the poor of the earth? So it is, using Fanon's words, is both the wretched of the earth and the wretched earth. And so this circularity has to be maintained. And then wrestle with the fact, okay, in Latin America, we do talk about class, but what class has to do with the crocodiles that been killed to become purses? So do they engage that sense of class? Or the trees that are being bulldozed here because of a new condominium, are they a part of a class? No, they are not. But then think more expansively in this sense, and then expand. Then I have to expand the notion of people, and not have the laos of the democracy, or kratos, or the democracy, but think in terms of other forms of beings, which is to blur the sense of culture and nature, which is to say that those trees right there are persons, as 3 persons, and those fishes are also fish people. And then what does it have to do with a sense of that expansive democracy? And who can...
If I may, forgive me, for these occasional interjections, because
keep doing all the time. You don't need to excuse.
No, God bless you. You're so brilliant, and I mean, really, what? Anyway, so I'm not going to go on about that. But you remind me of a Quranic verse, which, where from an Islamic point of view, from a Muslim point of view, Muslims believe God says that He created, all these creatures, all these animals as communities, like yourselves. You see, so you're speaking to that very Quranic verse without necessarily being. So this is what I'm blown away by, if I may say so. All the time in my admittedly limited but still sufficient interactions with some wonderful, beautiful Christian theologians like yourself, is how you're speaking to some of these deep truths, which all too often, if I may say this, I'm allowed to say this, you don't have to agree with me, but Muslim theologians have lost sight of, just because of your deep immersion, as far as I'm concerned, in seeking truth for the sake of truth. You are accessing truths that all too often Muslim scholars have lost sight of, when the texts itself themselves are speaking to you. Anyway, so I'm not going to go on and on about that.
That's fantastic. That is like a full echo Islam theology right here, just from this here. So I think that has to do also with the sense of communities, which gives a sense for me, if we stretch a little bit more in terms of God within the universe, which is a movement of then understanding God beyond the sense of belief systems, but in regards to processes and relationality. So to understand God more at the heart of the symbiotic markers, symbiotic movements, which is one thing weaving into the other and sprouting into new lives, creating the world, and the world being created by this billions of symbiotic encounters. And then everything becomes a wonder. Then everything becomes something to be in awe with. And so then I don't need the Christian separation of revelation as natural revelation and special revelation, as if the natural revelation is just like a pre-revelation to what really matters, which is Jesus. But then it blurs, and then
this sense of wonder, forgive me again, this is so key to the theological, to the religious experience. The religious spiritual experience ultimately is not some highfalutin theological abstract rarefied. That stuff is great. That stuff is, some people live for that, but that can't be the final, resting point, right? It's about evoking within ourselves through this kind of deep appreciation, not least of all of the natural world, of our sort of interactions, the symbiotic nature of all things, and coming to a place of awe and wonder. I'm reminded in this context very quickly. Forgive me, but
please.
Ibn Arabi, considered by many Muslim thinkers through history as Sheikh al-Akbar, the greatest teacher, and he thought that, to paraphrase, poorly, but essentially the highest state, as it were, of the believer, is one of bewilderment. Just being bewildered by the magic, of it all, right? That's the highest state. So the moment we kind of theologize and say this is how it is, we've lost sight of that bewilderment. We've limited God and in all its infinite manifestations, countless manifestations. Again, to the Akbarian conceit is that God, I forget the Arabic formulation now, but there is no repetition in God's manifestations. Each and every moment is a new manifestation. Every single infinitesimally small moment of time is a new manifestation. Just to reflect on that for a split second is like bewildering. But anyway, please continue.
Bewildered, exactly. Bewildered, which is to be transformed, have every seeing. And so there is a grammar of the senses where this bewilderment happens in all the body. It's not only a sense of a cognition of the mind, but what the hands can see, what the ears can touch, what the mouth can feel. And so it is this grammar of the sensuous that makes this bewilderment keep on growing. And so the apophatic theology does a little bit of it. The negative theology will do something with it. But there's something about the wonder of the movements of the body within and with this relationalities. And you mentioned this word that I love for the ritual part of it, was to evoke that which affected us, that it crossed me, it transformed me, and now I'm able to evoke something else. When we have this sense of this relation with, in being with the earth, there's something that is always evoking in me. And what is it that is evoking? And what is it that asks me to evoke when I am with it? And so in that way, it also breaks the the European sense of nature, which was the creation of Europe because they did not know what to do with the natural world. So they created a notion of nature in order to put it outside of them, and then you have to conquer. So it's that sense of transforming, separating like the thinking and the body. And so you have two entities, and you relate with the thinking, but the body is not needed. So that's our tradition, that we have to think with the mind as the body is something almost as a collateral, or almost an impediment. The whole notion of objectivity and subjectivity and all of that. But I think the sense of God within the universe
to that point,
is great.
Sorry again, but
It's out and in.
So I mean, you mentioned also the to paraphrase a little bit, but the Aristotelian premises from which we're working all too often, right, as modern subjects, and we work for. I don't have the whole because I was like taking notes very quickly, but all too often we're working from consciousness. Right, so I was hoping you could unpack that a little bit. What does it mean to work from consciousness? I mean, and that's the Cartesian problem, as it were, or the Cartesian conceit. I think, therefore I am. So coming from that very place, but how do we come from another place or multiple places? And I mean, lots to talk about. But you also mentioned relatedly. And it's all kind of related, ultimately, speaking of symbiosis and everything being interconnected, but the decolonial subject, right? Positing or speaking to a theology that is decolonial in nature, that decenters, as it were, the imperial, it's factually speaking, the very sad fact of the imperial nature of much of Christianity, not least of all Western Christianity, right? Eastern Christianity has a slightly different history. So if you could speak to some of these very, very important issues. One thing that I struggled with for some time after I had this sort of unusual experience in 2016 is, Christianity is this deeply, has the potential to be this deeply transformative tradition. It is a deeply transformative tradition, and yet one cannot ignore the fact that Christianity very often was wedded to colonial projects and the deep sort of atrocities that were done in its name, through its organizations, through its institutions and things like that. So sorry, lots. I'm going to throw a lot at you, but if you could speak to some of those issues.
Ooh, that's fantastic. Yeah, in some ways, I think the ways in which the Cartesian sense of thinking and sense of, because it is also subjectivity. It's always compartmentalized everything, and everything is inside of us. And so consciousness is only in the mind. So it was like Merleau-Ponty who would go and say, no, there's the body, the consciousness of the body and how we relate, and then he expands it. But there is another way of doing it, which is the way that we can learn with people who never lost touch with the land, and that is everywhere, indigenous people everywhere, which is a way of starting from a different consciousness, the consciousness of the land, which is our consciousness. There is no this trying to reconnect with that which we have never lost. But there is a sense in which we have not. So all of this modern approaches and attempts to go back to the land, it's always what Bruno Latour will say: we have never been moderns. Which is also a sense of we have never been detached from the earth. We are the earth. We are humus.
Yes,
right? We are made of it. So in that way, we have never been away from it. But it's also Bruno Latour says it like but that may of consciousness have made us never land. So we have never land. We live in the earth, but not landed on the earth. We live from everything from the earth. Everything, every single thing we have here is earth. But we live as if we have not arrived. We have not landed. So when he says we need to land, is to actually do this religare, which is a Christian sense of theology, which is to connect back, to fold back to what we have never lost in many ways. But it's different even if you go deeper into an indigenous way of thinking and work with the law of the land. There is a ways in which life comes from the ways in which the land lives. So there's what scientists, so that there's when we mimic, we do biological mimicry, then there is the way of living with. What are airplanes if not the mimicry of the birds? But the ways in which we do with the land and not against it.
To your point, sorry again, I remember there's a literal TED talk on this very topic. It's literally a notion called biomimicry.
Yeah,
right.
Biomimicry.
So they know that very often these hard problems, what present themselves as hard problems in engineering. So they had the example, I forget the professor's name who talks about this in one of these TED Talks I saw a few years ago. She's talking about, biomimicry, how we can see it in nature. I mean, how what we see in nature, if it's applied in our sort of artificial contexts, artificial inverted commas, because as you very importantly point out, nothing exists except that it's, part of the land. We're just kind of, but so they had this huge problem with these hyper sort of sonic trains. They used to call, if I'm not mistaken, the way they were designed initially, the fronts were pushing these massive columns of air, which led to all sorts of problems, not least for when they're going through tunnels and things like that. So then they realized they modeled. Now, if you see some of these really insanely bullet trains, I think they're called, they're not hypersonic yet, but they take they're modeled after the kingfisher's bill. So they have these really long sort of noses. So the kingfisher, when it, surprise, surprise, from a sort of theological point of view, God knows what he or she it is doing in creating the kingfisher like that. Clearly, where it goes into water almost, with limited ripple effect. So anyway, so then they did that and they got over that problem. And this happens all the time.
Fantastic,
all
isn't
the
it?
time in engineering. So
exactly, it is to work from that sense of consciousness, which then there's no dissolution or distinction or separation in many ways of the body of the land and the body of animals, creatures, humans, all of us. So it is this starting from the law of the land, and that's why it's regional, because near your house it's the law of the land that is not the law of the land here, because there's different kinds of consciousness. So it is a way of learning that consciousness and learning to walk with that will actually give us a better sense of how to live. So that's a different perspective than the whole desperate attempt of modernity that separated us, but now is trying to connect us again. But the sense of the decolonial, for instance, there's amazing stuff, and then when you say that this centers the an empire, and which is to the center the human species, that we need to do to the center the human species, and I think what we have not done is, like, for me, what is colonialism? Colonialism is basically the uprooting of people from the land, the cultus, the colus, and the culture. The colo is the ways in which you inhabit the land, or you make it somebody rent the land, and so is the inquilinus. And so I turn you from the inhabitant of the land into a renter of the land, which means that your entire form of life, of being, is ripped apart. When I rip you out of the land, you cannot have your religion, because religion has always been related to the ways of burying the dead. Because burying the dead has to do with life, and not only with the rite of passage. It is about how you maintain the structure of life going. When I take you off of the land, you lose your religion. Wow. And when I take you off of the land, I take you out of your culture, because your culture comes from the colus, the culture. There is no distinction between culture and nature, and so. But when you take it, then what is left to you? Culture. That's why you only talk about culture, human culture, and then there's this divide between the nature and culture. So for me, when we talk about decolonial stuff, if there is not something related to the land, it's still colonial. It's still uprooting you. It doesn't matter how you shift powers. If you are not taking care of, if you're not paying attention of the land, in whatever issue, racial, sexual, gender, work, whatever, for me, it's still uprooting us from the land. Still colonial.
I mean, the point that you make, I mean, so many powerful points. The point regarding specifically culture, how we, there's all this talk about culture, all this culture talk. And you make a very powerful point that, nature and culture, they're sort of historically intimately intertwined. Terry Eagleton has a very powerful book called Culture and the Death of God, where he kind of demarcates if I'm remembering the correct title, I read it a few years ago now, but he sort of demarcates how with the European Enlightenment, this culture thing had to be invented almost, as God sort of receded from mainstream discussions. So culture is almost a substitute for religion. But the point that you're making is that religion is nothing other than how people live, and to paraphrase you poorly, but how they live in commensality with one another, with the natural world, natural forms, and nature and culture. I mean, there's no need for speaking these sort of terms and these.
No, and the chapter 5 of the book is called From Multiculturalism to Multi-Naturalism, and which is a way that I'm engaging with Antônio Viveiros de Castro, this Brazilian anthropologist who studied indigenous people, and he would say, for us, non-indigenous people, there's one nature and many cultures. That's why there's whole, thing about multiculturalism, which is for me is anyways, we talk about multiculturalism. So for the indigenous peoples, it's the opposite. There's one culture and many naturalisms.
Oh wow, yes.
Because then the animals as one form of nature, but can gain a different form of that. So the jaguar drinking the blood is like, for him, it is a kind of it was as if a human drinking beer, because those natures can be mutable and you can become the other. So that's why there's a fear that if you go inside of the forest and you engage too much with the eyes, so there's a sense in which you lose the sense of your own nature.
Oh wow.
So there is the sense of one culture. We live in one culture, but there are different naturalisms, different natures.
Wow. And the different natures have to be respected. They have to be given their due, not just in some theoretical sense, but by that very example of do not stare into the eyes of the jaguar, lest you lose your sense.
But it's porous because you can
recognize the porosity of it, but it's also deeply respectful of the jaguar's jaguarness.
Exactly. Right. Exactly.
Wow. And you also mentioned, you touched upon briefly that we're all humus, right? But you mentioned that there are 5 themes within this eco-theology that you're adumbrating for us. if I'm remembering correctly, there are 5 themes. Could you speak to those 5 themes, please?
Can you remember that? Where is it that?
That's a great question. It's earlier on. It's earlier on. I
see. That's the thing. I never forget. Once I asked a
question. No worries at all. It's
I asked Leonardo Boff once to talk about something.
While I look for that, I'm sorry to put you on the spot there, but if you could speak also while I'm looking for those 5 themes, if you could speak to Lex Naturae. Please.
Yeah. So the whole thing also of this book is to give a sense of what would happen to theology if you think from the perspective of the earth. So then, like, the first chapter is how the whole liberation theology has to shift if we are to think from the perspective of the earth. For instance, salvation has to get into interbeings, and what Thich Nhat Hanh talks about interbeings, rather than a redemption of individual redemption of sorts, but the redemption is embedded in the relationality of the beings together, and so this is it is work with the theoretical ground of liberation theology from an ecological perspective and from a liturgical perspective, which means like from practices how the thinking changes. But Lex Naturae, which is like for Christians, usually liturgy has been thought in terms of 2 major things, which is lex credendi and lex orandi, which means the law of belief and the law of prayer. And so the question throughout is what is it that comes forth and first, and is it the belief that ordains the prayer, is the prayer that ordains the belief, and so all these things. And then later there will be like the lex credendi, which means the law of lex vivendi, which is the law of living, the ethical aspect that engages the belief and the prayer. So you have 3 forms of lexes, which is our laws. So for me, it depends on how we are living. We are living in a time that we are not going to have an earth for every world. We are not going to. They're talking that the ice caps are going to melt in 10, 15 years. We don't have time. We are getting into a moment where it is so unprecedented that we have no idea what's going to happen. And the earth is already changing. We have vast areas of the sea that are already dead. So we have the topsoil is disappearing from the earth. We have only 20% of forests still standing. So we are this world is finite, and we have to have limits. And that means that what is it that is going to give us a limit? The earth is going to give us a limit. It doesn't matter if something will destroy capitalism, it will be the earth. And so this major text that I wrote about Lex Naturae is to say, before the law of prayer, before the law of belief, or even the law of living, it has to come the law of the land, the law of nature. Well, I don't like to use much nature, but that's what I'm using. How the natural world has to orient my ways of praying. How the natural world and the law of the land has to organize my ways of believing. How it organized my way of living. So I cannot live the way I want. I cannot have all I want. I cannot buy all I want. And I cannot do the rituals that I have always done. I cannot believe in my God the way that I always believed in my God. Because if I keep doing that, there's not going to be a world for me to believe in anything. And so that's why it shifts from the belief to a sense of an immanentism that it flourishes, that opens up possibilities for the wonders of God within this universe to keep on happening. So the Lex Naturae is to say, how do I pray? The earth has to tell me. How do I believe? The earth has to tell me. How do I do my rituals? The natural law, the law of the land. And that means that my sense of God will change. My sense of faith and what I have received and the theologians that came before me that shaped me, it will have to change. That's the lex natura, the law that has to orient our lives.
Beautiful, so beautiful. I mean, you very frequently. I remember when I was very blessed to have sat in your classes at Union, just being moved time and time again by your presence and by your voice. And
Thank you,
and I love. No, thank you. Really, I love how you teaching and preaching and being speaking from the heart. These two are, they're very, you're not just speaking as an academic, you speak as someone with deep passion, you speak as a pastor, as a teacher, as a mentor, as a brother, as someone who's deeply compassionate. And this is what we need. I mean, this is genuinely what we need. It's not enough to just speak as, these kind of intellectuals are kind of isolated in their bubbles. I mean, one of the reasons I decided, I made a very conscious decision. It was a tough decision, but it was a necessary decision not to become a university professor. Is all too often academics preach too much to their own kind,
their own people.
To their own people. It's very kind of very theoretical, very abstract, very we need something that's real. And this is what you do. I mean, you remind me of this repeatedly. And I was looking earlier for the themes, just to kind of, we don't have to dwell too much on those themes, and there were not 5 themes, I misremembered, but humus, you mentioned, we're all soil, humus, stardust, and the memory of the universes. So beautiful. Assembly is another one of these themes. The liturgical gathering, the liturgical gathering teaches us that we are not only the people gathered. We're not only the people gathered. You mentioned COVID-19 has challenged our ways of understanding our ecclesiologies. The third theme is liturgy as event. And you say, I'm just mentioning, tiny, just sentences from what you say, go on to say in more detail. Any liturgy is a full event in the lives of its people. So it carries the gifts of prayers and orders of worship from people who are wrestling with their faith in historical contexts, reimagining the life of the church as an event from below, feeling and breathing with people in their daily lives. And finally, unconscious is the fourth theme. One of the problems with theologies, including liberation liturgies, is that we work too much in the mode of our consciousness. And we spoke a little bit earlier about the issue of consciousness. You go on to say, daughters of Aristotelian premises, liberation theologies act with the injunction of autonomy and emancipation, decision and liberation, action and responsibility, where the fruits of deliberation are calculations of means and ends, decision and possible choices. Anyway, I don't want to put words in your mouth, and these are your very words, but if you could speak a little bit to, the title of the book is so powerful. I mean, as everything else is super powerful and wonderful, which is just to remind ourselves of the title, right? The title is
Ritual at World's End.
Ritual at World's End, Essays on Eco-Liturgical Liberation Theology. And I had the title here written down as well. Can you speak a little bit to, you've already touched upon the issue of as far as we can tell, the imminence of the world's end. Can you speak a little bit to, for those who are, for the uninitiated, as it were, what is liberation theology? Because some of our listeners may not necessarily know what liberation theology is. Right. If you could speak a little bit to that, how does that tie in then with, the larger project as you are identifying?
Thank you, my brother. Thank you. Liberation theology is a movement that started in the late 60s and everywhere, and started in Latin America with Gustavo Gutierrez, Rubem Alves, and then Ivone Gebara, Nancy Cardoso, and so many others are developing it. And there are different forms of liberation theology. That's in Latin America, which is more engaging with the social injustice and class struggles. In North America, it starts with Professor James Cone, Dolores Williams, and many others who are going to work from the issue of class. And Africa we start with the notion of culture there, and then later on and then also Asia would have the Han theology or Dalit theology and sort of forth, and all what this liberation theology, and then you have queer liberation theologies as well, and feminist liberation theologies, and all of that is to say it is to break from the modern paradigm of theology as a universal that starts from the universal and then comes down into the local, but it starts from where people live. In some ways, it's what Professor Cohn used to say, theology starts where it hurts. And so in that way, it starts where it hurts, with the people that you live with. So it starts with the poor. So and then liberation theology in Latin America will say that God has a preferential love for the poor, which has been very much attacked everywhere. No, God loves everyone, but the God loves the preference for the poor has to do with, like, if you have two forests and one is burning, who you're going to care for first? You're going to go for the one who's burning. It's a triad. We're gonna do care for those who are suffering first, and so that's the major thing, and where it hurts, and then we see the earth is hurting now. And so that's where we start. And that's why eco-liberation theology. The notion of ritual at world's end, that was my editors who actually gave me this, and I love it. Because how do we ritualize both the end of the world, but at the end of the world? Which is to say that the world never ends and will continue in some way or another. So I'm not apocalyptic in here, but I am talking about the end of worlds that we know.
The end of one
ending.
cycle, as we know.
Yeah, we will need those worlds to end, and so that we can give space for other worlds to arrive. So we have to end with this capitalism and see this end, and then give 1,000 years for the earth to spring forth life back again. So there is a need for the end of this world, and not only holding back. So to do a ritual at the end of the world is to do with grief, with the end of what we know, and also prepared for what we have no idea. So that means that for this ritualizing the things that you mentioned there, to think about memory, for instance, in the gathering, in the ritual, what kind of memory do we have? Is often in the Christian environment is often about God's salvific act, but is in history somewhere else in the past and beautiful and done and great, but there is no memory of the natural world. When I think about my ancestors, they're not only humans. What are my ancestors and my trees? What do I remember about the vegetation of this time? About the rivers that were once here, or about the animals that once lived freely in this area and they're not here. So they must be the source of my memory. So I have to recover that memory. As one of the prophets will say, I want to bring to my mind what can brings me memory. I have to bring to my memory what brings me hope. So think about that can also bring me some sense of connectedness. The assembly, it has to change. It's not assembly of the humans. It's the assembly of all beings. I remember I did this one worship at Union where we put all of the chairs and we put rocks and flowers and insects and other things to remind, and a fish in a bowl, but just to remind us that they are part of the assembly. And how do we assemble ourselves with them? And so that has to change the stories spoken in worship services. So the story of God has to be the story of the fish, of the flying fish, or has to be the story of the hummingbirds, have to be the story that is woven, is what Donna Haraway will call the string figures, which is a composition of several stories together. It's like Anat Singh talks about the fungus and understands the whole capitalism story through the fungi. So you see other species as part of the human history. So that's what we need to do in the worship service, to see that the creation, it's the entire thing. It's not like humans only.
If I may mention, you just reminded me in that beautiful description of this, portion of verses from Rumi, and he said, in translation, of course, I died as mineral and became a plant. I died as plant and rose to animal. I died as animal and I was human. Why should I fear? When was I less by dying? Yet once more I shall die human, to soar with angels blessed above. And when I sacrifice my angel soul, I shall become what no mind ever conceived. As a human, I will die once more, reborn I will with the angel soar. And when I let my angel body go, I shall be more than mortal mind can know.
Oh my goodness, isn't that it? Oh,
yeah. I'm to your point.
That's it. That's exactly it. Oh, you have to send this to me.
Of course, yeah. No, I mean, but to your point, it's recognizing our history, not just in human terms, but in non-human terms. And so our history, but also our current story, is one of commensality, mutuality, right? The Buddhists are very good at knowing this, at recognizing this as a part and parcel very often of their everyday practice, right? Recognizing the fundamental interconnectedness of everything.
It's what Thich Nhat Hanh talks about, the naming, how I call you by my name or call you by your name, which is so many names. The name of the mineral is my name. The name of the waters are my name. The names of the mycelium are my name, right? Because my body has 1,000 names, because in my body I have so many cells that are not humans, who make me human.
No, they estimate, if I'm not mistaken, it's something insane, something like 80 or 85% of our genetic material is not even human.
Precisely.
It's microbial. It's like
microbial, that's right.
It's like stuff, it's like alien DNA, like not so, but these microbes play a vital role in our well-being. So I mean, it's
fantastic. If we go there, I am human by ways of non-humans, of these creatures, of these microbes who love me so much so that if there is a pain here, they are all, this entire being are going to get together and say, let's fix that, which is very different from what we learned from biology in the 60s, which was the selfish DNA, which was a way of giving biological ground or scientific ground to capitalism and liberalism that was coming forth, and which was completely opposite of what we are constituted of. We are constituted of assemblies, of gatherings, of solidarity, of deep love.
So beautiful. This narrative that you've already alluded to, this narrative, this kind of Darwinian narrative that, maybe poor Darwin, like some simplified Darwin narrative, or maybe it's true that, survival of the fittest. He didn't literally use that phrasing, but as some students or whatever the case may be. But this is the mainstream narrative. The selfish DNA that you mentioned. So, is it the line from Frost, the famous line that nature is red in tooth and claw? It turns out nature is much more about cooperation than it is about domination and fighting and annihilation. Because it's. I mean, there's so much cooperation that happens on that, to use that term, on the in the sort of non-human realms that we as human beings all too often we've forgotten, because we've internalized these narratives, very often these colonial narratives, these sort of liberal, neoliberal narratives, these capitalistic narratives. And we have to we have to unlearn these narratives, right?
Unlearn this. And it has to do also with a sense of, we have to change our sense of time, if we're thinking about that, because we have a time as, Hegel and Christianity and this telos, like the end of history, and the telos to like the coming of Jesus or the coming of God. And so we live as if we are heading towards something. And that, if I have that, so if I use or abuse of what I have, it's whatever it takes to get there. But when we have a different sense of time, that when time is cyclical, when we see that the fullness of life, that's like ritual is an event, because the fullness of life right here, fullness of life where we are with all the beings that are around me, the chipmunk in the back of my house, the mice now that I can see that are in my roof, the amora, and everybody, it's a fullness of a much larger life here. So in when we have that sense of the fullness, we can see how animals never run out of food, even if they have to hunt, because they know what to hunt.
Yeah.
They usually get the elderly ones because they cannot run. And so, and the young can continue. And so with indigenous living with the buffaloes here, the buffaloes never went extinct, but when the colonized, the settlers come, that's when we have Plenty Coupe, the chief of the crows. He said, he starts this painful note when he said, when the buffalo went out, our hearts fell to the ground. And the buffaloes went out because they were destroyed, they were killed, they were decimated, because there's no limit. And there's this convergence of life. There's one video on the YouTube that shows how in the Standing Rock, this indigenous people are fighting, and there's the police there holding that place for the pipelines, and then all of a sudden you see the buffaloes coming, and the indigenous say they came for us.
Wow.
I had goosebumps when I saw that, because there's a convergence of living.
Yes.
My living is your living, your living is my living, my death is your death is my death. That is what shifts and turns. It's not about going somewhere, aiming at something, is not fulfilling some sense of religious fullness, but it is about living the fullness of time, present, future, and past right here. That changes the way in which we relate to one another, because there is a circularity of life, and it's not something that I'm going against you because I need to get there.
No, and this is so powerful, as everything we've been saying has been so powerful. I'm reminded actually of two film references. I very often think through films, for better and for worse.
Yeah, I teach with films too.
So Jim Jarmusch's very interesting 90s movie starring Johnny Depp. It's a black and white movie called Dead Man. And right at the start, I mean, I'm not going to, but Johnny Depp's character, he gets shot very early on in the movie, and throughout the movie he's dying basically, and therefore he's the dead man. But in his kind of journey, he thinks he has this job at this sort of outpost. This is during the height of the Wild West, quote unquote, right? And he sort of takes this very long trip on a train to where he thinks he has a job, and he's talking to the passenger sitting opposite him, and just mid-conversation, there's this signal that's given. All of a sudden, all the passengers, barring Johnny Depp, who's kind of plays a bit of a fool, like a simpleton, as it were, all of a sudden, all these passengers start pointing out the rifles out the moving train's windows, shooting at buffalo for no reason. They just decimate all these buffalo. It's this comic moment, but deeply tragic. And then once they're done, they go back to talking again. You know, in many ways, it's a deeply interesting movie. And that movie I highly recommend because Johnny Depp's character, if I'm not mistaken, he goes to something of a sort of spiritual, it's a deeply spiritual story in many ways. So he goes through this almost like a conversion process where he becomes absorbed into the Native American ways. And this one character who sort of takes him on this journey, who's, I think he's half Native American, half, European. Anyway, he takes this, anyway, by the end of it, Johnny Depp has this watch
Dead Man.
Dead Man. It's a beautiful, very Jim Jarmusch, very offbeat, but brilliant movie. I think it's actually one of his masterpieces. Another filmic reference.
What is the other one?
Is so many people think this as a kind of superficial, just a blockbuster movie, but some very serious academics have written about it. It's Avatar. James Cameron's Avatar is a deeply thoughtful, very brilliantly written. Many people say, it has the white savior complex thing, but I think it's much deeper than that. And right towards the end, when the natives, right, the indigenous populations, they're fighting the kind of the white colonial imperial capitalistic machine. And they're almost like decimated, right? They're struggling. They're almost dead. The animals, all of a sudden, they storm in, and they come from nowhere, and they decimate the corporate machine. Which I don't think that's accidental. I think to your point, I really believe this. I mean, to your point about the Standing Rock story, if we are in tune with with the deep sort of cyclical nature of the world, not just in some superficial sense, but in the sort of natural sense, to use that problematic term, but it's the best we can do maybe for now, then the natural world supports us in its way, because it's to use that kind of mystical phrase, the eternal now. If we're living in the eternal now, then all the magic of the now, it just comes to us in some magical fashion, which is not just some fancy kind of tool that James Cameron used in that, it's not like Deus, it's not, natura ex machina, right? It's something deeper than that.
It is. It's much deeper than that, because the eternal now entails the fullness of the past and entails the fullness of the future. So that's why every moment in the present I have to do, as Edward Said said, quoting Gramsci, to do an inventory of what Gramsci calls the infinite of traces that goes without name. So if we are to live the eternal now, there must be an inventory of our past. But then it has to be also a way of looking and seeing the future. That what is going to be for the next generation. So the eternal now is not a consummation of time in the sense that it strips everything, but it is the confounding and the living at the same time of what is, was, and will be fully here. And for that, we need that sense of I was just trying to look for the what is that movie, the something of the wild beasts. I'm terrible with proper names. I never remember. I cannot remember here.
There's a movie title.
Yeah, some.
No worries. As you remember that, the Gramsci quote, I actually happen to use right at the start of my novel, Red and Green, Oil and Water. And if it's the same quote where Gramsci, he says, the starting point of critical elaboration is the consciousness of what one really is and is knowing thyself as a product of the historical process to date, which has deposited in you an infinity of traces without leaving an inventory. Therefore, it is imperative at the outset to compile such an inventory.
That's what Edward Said says at the very beginning of Orientalism, and so it is at the onset. We have to do this inventory. We have to name the infinite, to figure out what are the infinity of traces.
Yes.
That lies all over my body, my history, my living together, and that's the way that we find a different future, because I am working in a different present, from different ways of thinking and believing and praying and doing. It is, and for that we need it's the beasts of the southern wild. And there's this little girl that has this beast that is always with her. It's enormous, gigantic beasts. And so one point at the end, they finally look at each other in the eyes, and they're like scary, but she looks in the eyes and she tells them, we are friends, sort of, which is all that we can get to the other beings. To the tree that I love, I can tell her, beautiful. We are friends.
Sort of. That's genius. I love that.
Because there's still so much to discover. There's still so much to learn. There's still so much that I don't know about you. There's still so much to be done and related.
And to be respectful, to go back to the recognition, right, that you mentioned earlier, of the difference between the jaguar and myself.
Yes.
I should not seek to domesticate the jaguar.
No.
The jaguar is a wild beast. Its beauty, its magnificence is in its in
this full being.
It is. We cannot declaw it and put it in a cage. Like that's unfortunately the colonial mentality, right? Which that's
what we do with everything.
It's a human problem. The colonial mentality is a human problem, right? Not to say the colonial mentality is something outside of myself. I have that mentality within me by virtue of being a human being. So I have to take stock of that, acknowledge that I should not seek to. It's one thing to have a domestic dog, right? I have a beautiful dog, Aria. She's a German Shepherd. She's amazing. She loves me. I love her. That's one. But the domestic dog is not the same as a wolf, right? For example. Right. So I have to give the wolf its due, right?
It does. You do, but how do we do that without the fear of all of the animals and the beasts? Just look what we are doing, the Anthropocene and colonialism. We are taking all the immense variety and diversity of the earth and turning into few examples. All of the enormous quantities of animals and insects, we are just allowing 5 kinds of animals to exist. Cows, pigs, dogs, horses. We do not allow, we do not have, we are afraid. That's why, who are not afraid of everything? We're afraid of everything. We are learning, we are growing up in this fear of everything. And some ways, being fearful of a snake, we are close to it, of course. But there's this fundamental fear of what is not human and what is not tamed. And that fear, it's either a sense of I can shoot or I have to shoot. I either can, like the dead men, because they're not here, they're just fun, because there's no connection. And so if we get there's more than 3,000 to 5,000 forms of grains in, I don't remember exactly, I wish I had it here to give to you, but we only have few grains. If you had corn, there are hundreds of forms of colors of corns.
Yes.
What do we have now? One type.
The great the writer on ecology and thinker and activist Vandana Shiva talks about this, right?
Vandana Shiva talks about that, yes.
So the incredible, I mean, to your point, the incredible variety of grains, right? Hundreds, if not thousands. And what we have with the sort of corporatization and the patenting, which is a real evil of these grains. So you know, her kind of, as you know, one of her kind of tasks, as she sees it, is to empower indigenous peoples and to tell them, save your grains and sort of sow with those and maintain that, because
that's what
they have a deep wisdom. The grains themselves have a deep wisdom, right?
That's what local people are doing. That was indigenous are doing. They're doing banks of seeds because they're being stealing. Look what Monsanto, who is now Bayer, what they do. They steal. They throw the seeds into the fields, and when it comes, they come to the owner of the land and say, "Hey, this is ours. Look at that. But I never planted your seed. But look at this," because they threw it. It is stealing. That's the work of colonialism, is what Jesus said of the devil in John 10:10. The devil came to destroy, to steal, and kill. That's the work of extractivism. It is to kill, to destroy, and to steal. That has been the history of coloniality, of slavery, of this neoliberal time that we're living, where Achille Mbembe called the brutalism, which is to fissure, destroy, uproot, extract everything. And I think extractivism is a metaphor of our time, because everything is about extraction. We are being extracted from our emotions. That's why depression, panic attack, we've been extracted from money. We have more and more, we have less and less. We've been extracted from our faith because it is taking away the possibility of relationality. We've been extracted from our energy, from our body, from what we can give. And so we are, everything, it feels like today in the world, we're stretched thin to the point, and some of the social threads are eroding. So it must be a way of thinking differently, to create differently, to live differently from what the indigenous people teaches us from the law of the land. If we do that, there will be a chance. If we don't do that.
Amazing. So powerful. I mean, there's so much more to talk about, but I want to be respectful of your time, and I know you have you're a very busy professor, so you have other things to do, but maybe you know, that's, we could end on one, you know, final, and that's a very powerful point that they just mentioned. Maybe we can end on a positive note, and you know, an additional positive note, that what hope do we have as individuals? You know, we're individuals, but we work in communities, and how can look for towards the future with a sense of possibility? What do our traditions offer? What, not least of all, Christianity? What does Christianity offer as far as thinking ahead with a sense of possibility?
Yeah, I think we have to start small. We start with where we are. We start with a different sense of relation and love. Love the land you are. So Hassan, what is the vegetation of your landscape, of your environment? Who are the trees near you? Who are the animals that live with you? What are the birds? Do you know the birds? What kind of birds? What do they do? What do they eat? Is the river next to your house alive? Are there fish there? What are the indigenous trees? What are the things that were brought into it and now creates a diversity? Pay attention to the land where you live. Start there. Pay attention. Walk. And I started in a way that now, when I go for my walks, I cannot pass any tree without nodding, without saying thank you. So it's a different relation, as if they exist. It is. So it's a beautiful way to finish, because to go back to what you began with. see a being seen. Not only people, but that flower that is right there next to you. What's the name of this flower? How do you relate with this flower? Is this flower part of you? You talk to it. You, like Robin Kimmer will say, talk to the plants. Give them a name. Call them he or she or they. Don't call them it. Start there. And those are the small rituals that you can start. So then you can start to flourish. And then you see that what I have, so then I see that what I have in my faith doesn't have any plant, any trees. And so I need that. And then I start to shift my thinking. I start to shift my feeling. And so because my body has a different grammar, sensuous grammar, I need to think differently. And now I cannot think without my river, Conor Gwyneth, because it's essential to my living. I go there and honor this river. I call it my great grandfather. I call my tree my great grandmother. And that it is a different way of relating. And that is where everything, I believe, starts. It's not in the big scheme of things, but of course, fighting against the empire, getting into groups and that are fighting and changing policies and changing politicians and politics and be on the larger scheme of things. But that will keep us powerless and feel like we have to do nothing. It is not about taking a shower with less water. It's not much about recycling. It's not. It is about love what is the piece of land, the soil, the worms. Pay attention. See. Let them be seen. Pay attention. And we start there. And then I believe we can have ripple effects. And then I will be different. Because when I come back from my walk, I can say, oh, I had all these trees that are there with me. I'm not alone. Beautiful. I just went, and I'll finish with this. I went to Brazil to visit my mother, 19-year-old. For the first time, Hassan, I'm 52. For the first time in my life, I pay attention to the trees. I walked around and I discovered there are more than 30 trees in 2 streets, small, 4 corners, between 4 corners, 30 streets. They give 9 kinds of fruits. And I never pay attention. And they help me grow up. So I went to each one of them. I'm sorry I never pay attention to you. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you because you loved me. And I never knew that you loved me. And to the new ones, I said, welcome to this neighborhood. I hope you feel good here, and I hope people will treat you well. We start there, and everything else might change. Thank you.
Well, I mean, that's just, I mean, that's so beautiful, so powerful, and yeah, very, very moving. Yeah, I really appreciate all of that, and not least of all, you're making a very powerful, and some may say controversial point, that it's not about recycling. It's not about using less water when you shower. It's about paying attention. It's about seeing, appreciating, loving the beings that we're surrounded by. The trees, the plants, the ants, the birds.
That's right.
And maybe that's even more powerful than all the activism that we can think of doing. Maybe that's what real change is about. Maybe change begins in this apparently small fashion, perhaps because when we have this deep sort of communion with all of creation, then we have a deeply transformative religious experience. It's existential. It's not just theoretical. And then we can go, it's daily, it's every day, it's each and every moment, right? Then we can go out in the world, and our very presence perhaps can be transformative. And if 1 or 2 and 5 and 10 and 20, 100 of us can start doing that, maybe that's how transformation happens.
Precisely. And then if we start to, is that a change of relation? To pausing, to pay attention. And then we pause with the earth, and then we see there's some things wrong. And then from there, the awareness of way more people that will say, you're not going to take that tree away from me anymore. You're going to have, and then you have to go clean this river right now. And all of these things that moves and expands, and then we'll feel better. And we'll see that the singing of the bird is better than anything else. Then your day is changed when you're able to pay attention. I was teaching my kids to pay attention to the birds, and I said, let's go. We were walking. I said, stop, pay attention. So do what? So what is that? Oh, look at that. Can you hear? Hear what? The birds. And they, all right. And so that passed. 3 months later, my son was 7 years old. I'm taking him to the bus stop, and he said, Dad, stop. I said, stop for what? Can you hear it? Hear what? What are you talking about? The birds. So
amazing.
We start to remember each other, to listen to the birds.
Beautiful. Well, Professor Carvalhaes, really, really such a joy, pure joy and honor and blessing to have you with us today. May God really continue to empower you each and every day, for many, many years to come, yourself and your beautiful family. And may we all genuinely benefit from your deep compassion and love and insights and wisdom. And may we take some of your teachings and put them into practice and hopefully better ourselves a little bit and learn to appreciate everything around us with greater presence. Because all we have is the present moment. And all we have is presence.
That's presence, and that's it. That's it. Thank you, my friend. I'm very grateful to you, to your generosity, the generosity of your heart, the brilliance of your mind, expanding, bringing all of these things and resources for us to feast on. And I'm so grateful to you. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm very humbled and very honored. Thank you.
Blessings to you, and we'll get together again.
We will. We must. And yeah, onwards and upwards, because this knowledge that you have must more people must have access to it. I really believe this.
I appreciate
blessings
that.
to you. Thank you so much. Talk soon. God bless you. Bye now.